Okay, so let's unpack this. We've got this pile of sources, articles, notes, you name it, all focused on Alberto Daniel Hill. He pops up online in a few different ways, doesn't he? Cybersecurity guy, convicted hacker, even an author?
Yeah, it's definitely a complicated picture painted across all this material we gathered. So the mission for this deep dive really is to pull out the key insights from everything we have here, try to get a handle on his journey, and the different stories, the contested narratives swirling around him. Think of it as a way for you to get up to speed on a really pretty intriguing case.
Okay, so where do we start? The background stuff and the sources takes us to Uruguay. He got into tech early, it seems, like a Sinclair Spectrum computer when he was 10.
Right, and apparently his first hack, if you can call it that, was modifying a game when he was 14, which interestingly, the sources say even got published somewhere. He did get a formal computer engineer degree, but a lot of the material highlights he was mostly self-taught in security.
Okay. And he spent decades in the field, doing things like computer forensics.
Exactly. Decades in information security. The notes mention roles in forensics, yeah, and even collaborations with Interpol and the Uruguayan government at certain points.
So a solid technical background.
Yeah.
But then, well, this is where the sources really pivot, right, to the main event. The thing that seems to define a lot of his public story, this Operation Bitcoins affair.
That's it. So around 2014, the sources describe him finding a pretty serious vulnerability. Apparently something really basic like admin access in a medical provider system in Uruguay.
Wow, admin, okay.
And then fast forward 2 years to 2016, that same place does get hacked. But critically, the sources suggest it was someone else entirely.
Not him.
Not him doing this 2016 hack, according to these accounts. This attacker demanded, I think it was 15 Bitcoin, threatened to leak really sensitive patient data focusing on specific conditions, which is pretty nasty.
Yeah, definitely. So the authorities got involved. Operation Bitcoins.
Right. And the police accounts detailed in some of these sources say they traced an IP address linked to the extortion email back to his place.
Back to Hill's residence. Whoa. Okay, and what did the police say they found? The sources mention.
Well, according to those police reports in the material, they raided his home, found equipment, hacking tools, and also, kind of strangely, a Guy Fawkes mask and a guillotine.
A guillotine? Seriously?
That's what's in the police description in the sources, yeah. And, crucially, they claimed he made a verbal confession right then and there. So he was arrested, imprisoned in 2017, became known apparently as the first hacker jailed in Uruguay. That's one side of the story from these documents.
It's a very strong side.
Yeah.
But then you dig into other sources, particularly his own accounts, and it's completely different.
Absolutely. A stark contrast. He consistently maintains his innocence, says he was prosecuted for a crime he never committed, one he even suggests probably never happened. He makes allegations of police misconduct, calls the whole thing an unfair trial. He describes it as this sad, unbelievable, yet true story that fundamentally changed him.
So, two totally conflicting narratives for the different sources we have. And what was the final legal outcome?
Well, after a legal process that took about 4 years, the sources state his criminal record was cleared around 2021, maybe early 2022, and the case was officially closed.
Okay, so legally cleared in the end, but the whole experience, the ordeal, clearly left a massive mark.
No doubt. And then there's this other layer we found mentioned often in like the promotional material for his books, this claim that he was someone called La Llama Violeta, the Violet Flame.
The Violet Flame, what's that about?
This figure was supposedly behind something called the Violeta leaks around 2010. These leaks allegedly exposed political corruption in Uruguay, and the narrative presented in some sources claims they shook the nation, maybe even helped a new political movement rise.
That sounds huge, a government toppling leak.
Yeah.
But you mentioned looking at other sources.
Yeah, and that's where it gets interesting. When you look into, say, independent historical accounts or academic analyses of Uruguayan politics from that specific period, the stuff you shared, that direct, dramatic impact, like a government falling because of those specific leaks, it's not always clearly verified or presented with that same level of certainty.
So the scale of the impact described in some places doesn't quite line up with others?
Exactly. Plus, the sources also point out he's written fictional techno-thrillers featuring a hacktivist group called Llama Violeta fighting corruption, but set in places like Mexico. So, the line between his claimed real-world activities and the stories he tells in his fiction, it can get pretty blurry.
Okay, all right. So pulling all this together from the sources.
Yeah.
What's the takeaway here? He's clearly taken all these experiences, the tech background, the legal fight, getting cleared, and used them to build this very public persona.
Absolutely. He's become a really prolific author, writing nonfiction about his own case, like Operation Bitcoins. And he's got fiction inspired by his life coming out, too. He has a podcast. He's been a guest on shows like Darknet Diaries.
And he's active in crypto and Web3 stuff now, too,
Wow.
running a company.
Yeah, very active in those communities, crypto, NFTs, Web3. Runs his own tech and security company that seems focused on those areas. And he consistently pushes this philosophy. Human knowledge belongs to the world.
Okay. Using that idea to frame his advocacy.
Sort of positioning himself, yeah. Drawing on his own story, his legal battles, as context for why information should be free, why he does what he does. It underpins his advocacy work, especially around, say, ethical hacking.
So the journey we see across these sources is, well, it's quite something. From tech expert through this really intense legal storm and public scrutiny to now actively crafting his own narrative as an author, a voice, an advocate for. Maybe ethical hacking, maybe justice reform more broadly.
Yeah, it really highlights how someone in today's world can use all these digital tools, books, podcasts, social media, not just to share their skills, but to actively redefine themselves and tell their version of the story, especially after facing major public heat and legal action.
Which leaves us, and you listening, with a pretty important question, I think. When you encounter these kinds of complex stories online in this digital age where anyone can craft and broadcast their narrative so effectively, how do you actually figure out what's objectively true? Especially when you've got these competing versions woven into really compelling personal accounts, maybe even fiction. Definitely something to chew on from what we've looked at today.